For the past 7 decades, the name Carnahan has been associated with progressive causes and high standards in public office, both in Missouri and across the country. Jean Carnahan carried forth those traditions in the fall of 2000 when she agreed to accept an appointment to the United States Senate after Governor Mel Carnahan was tragically killed in a plane crash, along with their son Randy and with Chris Sifford, a longtime aide to the governor. As the first woman to represent Missouri in the United States Senate, she became a leading advocate of education. Her first bill, the Quality Classrooms Act, became an important element in the No Child Left Behind law that was passed in 2001. After the attacks of September 11th, she traveled to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and other Central Asian nations as a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee. In supporting the men and women of the U.S. Armed Forces, Senator Carnahan secured an extension of health care benefits for returning reservists and members of the National Guard. She jokes that the Carnahan family's political nature may come from a genetic defect. Well, I can tell you, our region and our nation have benefited from it. Senator, it's my pleasure to give you the 2010 Harry S. Truman Good Neighbor Award. And that's actually this.
Well, thank you very, very much, Carl. And I'm so happy to have my family, part of my family at least, here to share this wonderful award with me today. And someone, too, who has been very close to our family for so many years that I have referred to him as my fourth son, John Beakley. Will you stand up? And there are some dear friends here, one of which I have known for 40 years, Ruth Ann Phillips of Kansas City. Would you stand up, Ruth Ann? Thank you all for being here, and I have a number of other friends that I have known for 20 years or more. For instance, John and Linda Truman out here at the same table, and Jonathan Kemper here, and Carl Zobrist, and the Robs are here somewhere. I think Anita Robb, I thought I saw just a little while ago. I appreciate them being here as well. And then yesterday, actually, Mike Devine helped me to see some of the treasures at the Truman Library, and I appreciated him doing that. And then certainly Kevin Pastelli, who hosted the dinner for us last night. It's wonderful that he is still carrying on in the tradition of his father, and I appreciate that, as I know you do as well. And certainly to be here with Colonel Bob Hewlin, that is to share this opportunity with you. I'm grateful for your patriotism and for your service. Thank you so much. Well, as I look through the program today, at the many recipients of the Harry S. Truman Good Neighbor Award, I'm both honored and humbled to be among them. In fact, I think I now know how Charlie Brown felt when he was lying on top of the hill looking up at a cloud formation. And he turned to Lucy and Linus and he said, "What do you see in those clouds?" And Lucy spoke up and she said, "I see an outline of Raphael's Madonna." Linus looked up and he said, "Well, I see the southeast wall of the Sistine Chapel." Well, Charlie Brown was quiet, and finally Lucy said, "Well, Charlie Brown, what do you see?" And he said, "Well, I was going to say a horsey and doggy, but I don't think I'll bother." Well, there are so many books and speeches and quotations that attempt to define Harry Truman's life. But one of my favorite lines comes from a British newspaper written back in 1946. He wrote, "President Harry Truman is the living, kicking symbol of what everyone likes about America." And he was right. David McCullough said, "Harry Truman was what the founding fathers had in mind for our country. He came directly from the people. He was America." His grit and his goodness, his common sense and his courage make him admired all over the world. I've stood in Athens, Greece, where there is an 18-foot bronze statue of Harry Truman in that city among the Greek gods and the orators of the past, a symbol of their gratitude for him, for all he did in aiding their country. But Harry is also remembered in more humble ways. For instance, the organic farmers in the state of Maine salute him with their annual Harry S. Truman Memorial Manure Toss and Horseshoe Pitch, in which contestants compete to see who can shovel a 25-pound load the farthest. Now, the organic farmers are fans of Truman because of his fondness for using the word manure, a usage that you recall best Truman encouraged to keep him from using a more descriptive term. Well, Harry is admired far and wide because of his down-home qualities that connected him to people, no matter whether he was in a foxhole in France or whether he was on the campaign trail or in the Oval Office or at a summit of world leaders. I'm pleased that our family had some small but I think meaningful connection to the Truman family. I recall my husband telling me of getting in the family's old green Plymouth, along with his father, and driving several hours from South Missouri to Kansas City to hear Truman speak at Kiel Auditorium on October 30th, 1948. Do any of you know what that was besides Mike? It was the final speech of Truman's whistle-stop tour that had taken the president more than 21,000 miles in 33 days, delivering more than 300 speeches in 250 cities to more than 6 million people. Despite the hard work, though, things didn't look good. Politicians and pollsters and pundits had written him off. One newspaper speculated who President Dewey might name for his cabinet members. Another newspaper wrote, he was a game little fella who went down fighting with all he had. Well, that was the atmosphere that Sunday. Melanie's father arrived at Kiel Auditorium. They got there late, parked some distance away, walked through the drizzling rain and through that group of some 10,000 people that were outside the auditorium. When they got inside, there were another 12,000, some of them lining the walls. The seats were all taken. But because Mel's father was a Democratic candidate for Congress in South Missouri that year, they had to put him someplace, though. They put him on the stage, behind the podium. And that's where they heard the last speech, last campaign speech that Harry Truman would ever give in his own behalf. The speech had a profound effect on a 14-year-old boy from the Ozarks. From that day on, he knew what he wanted to do with his life, and he never wavered from that call to public service that he felt at such a young age. Well, meanwhile, I was a teenager growing up in Washington, D.C., and later that same year, we would meet, and he would tell me about having sat on that stage, just feet from the president, to hear the most exciting speech he had ever heard. And he told me about his own hopes of someday going to Congress. Well, the tide of events meant that he would never realize that dream. Sadly, 50 years later, it would be me, not him, who would go to the United States Senate and take the seat that Harry Truman once held. As the old saying goes, life is not the way it's supposed to be. It's the way it is, and it's how we cope with it that makes the difference. Today, our son serves in the United States Congress, and my daughter is running for the United States Senate. But I like to think it all began on that stage back in 1948, when a teenage boy was inspired by two men he admired most, his father and Harry Truman. I don't tire of telling the story about Truman's 1948 campaign, and people don't tire of hearing it, because it shows the incredible triumph of the human spirit in face of almost certain defeat. Anyone who has had to cope with naysayers and hopelessness finds consolation in Truman's struggle and optimism. We smile when we see that, whether of what political party we might be, we smile when we see that newspaper that he holds up the day after the election. And we're delighted when we hear that recording of Truman mimicking H.V. Kaltenborn's election night predictions. Truman taught us not to let others define who we are or what we can accomplish. He showed us that we don't have to be victims we can be victors. Clark Clifford, a speechwriter and staffer for Harry Truman, wrote why he thought Truman won in 1948. He said, "It was the remarkable courage of the man, the refusal to be discouraged, his willingness to go through the suffering of that campaign, the fatigue, the will to fight every step of the way, the will to win. It wasn't Harry Truman, the politician, who won. It was Truman, the man." Well, I've always felt you could tell a lot about a person by some of the small things they do, some of the things that seem trivial or ordinary. I have a photocopy of a calendar, appointment calendar, that Truman used during the Senate race of 1934. It was one of those small pocket calendars that you carried with you in your shirt pocket. He carried it around with him in that sound car as he went around the state with the loudspeaker horns on top and the campaign signs on the side of the car. That summer was the hottest on record. And of course, there was no air conditioning in cars that year. And he spent a lot of time riding along with the windows rolled down and his shirt sleeves rolled up. There's a lot to learn about Harry from what he chose to include in those daily entries. And I don't know that anyone has written about that. It might be an interesting study to pursue, but I thought I'd share some observations that I made. Occasionally, there would be notes indicating who was for him and who was against him in certain towns, and how many people turned out to see him. Even then, Harry thought loyalty was important. It was a trait he valued in others, and it was one he certainly valued in himself. And he kept a careful accounting of his expenses, how much he spent on gas and oil. And evidently, the old car was a bit of an oil guzzler from the number of entries that was made. He made notes of what he spent on meals, noting how much he even gave to the waitress as a tip. Even then, he was interested in working people. But the notations that I enjoyed the most were the ones that said, "Call Bess." Now, bear in mind, this was a long-distance call. And I recall some years later growing up that we didn't make many of those calls because those were extra, and you only made a long-distance call for important things. Well, family was important to Harry, and he would, from time to time, take time out at the end of a day to talk to the boss, which is what he called Bess. When I went to the Senate in 2001, I had the privilege of sitting at the desk that Truman occupied after he won that 1934 race. And more than once I lifted that lid of that desk and I'd look down at the signature that he had carved in the bottom of it, as is the custom in the Senate. And I wondered, what would Harry do? What would he say had he been there for some of those tough votes? We know that he was there in Washington during a time when the country was facing many of the same problems we're facing today. An intractable war, a stumbling economy, divisions within, and threats without. Certainly, we can't say for sure what he would have done, but we can extrapolate from what he did do as to what he might have done. For instance, I have no doubt that Harry would have been all over those unscrupulous military contractors for doing the very same things today that they were doing back in World War II. As a U.S. Senator, he headed up the Truman Committee, calling nearly 1,800 witnesses during 432 hearings and writing 51 reports. His pursuit of war profiteers saved the country some $15 billion in waste, fraud, and abuse. And he made changes in the military as well. He ruffled a few feathers, but he integrated the military at a time when 80% of the people disapproved. He didn't do it because it was the popular thing to do. He did it because it was the right thing to do. And undoubtedly, Harry would have been in the thick of the health care battle. During his presidency, 40% of the counties in the United States had no access to a local hospital. He was also aware that we had a shortage of doctors and nurses and clinics across America and in rural areas especially. Teddy Roosevelt had brought up health care. FDR had talked about it, but it was Harry Truman who actually came up with a plan. Well, no matter what he did, whatever he undertook, Harry Truman was guided by two core principles: determination and duty. Even when he was a young boy wearing those heavy metal rimmed glasses, he was determined he was going to read everything he could get his hands on. And later, as a young man, determined to do his patriotic duty, he memorized the eye chart so he could pass the physical to get into World War I. And when the love of his life, Bess Wallace, turned down his marriage proposal, he persisted until she became his wife. And in 1945, when the moon, the stars, and all the planets descended on him, as he described that time after FDR's death, he dutifully assumed the presidency, and he proceeded to end the war and lead the recovery. His firm determination, his strict sense of duty made him the man that we remember today. So what might he say to us personally today and as a nation? From what we know of Harry, I think his comments might be along this line. Don't give up on life or family or friends just because they sometimes disappoint. And don't give up on democracy because some tend to magnify its faults and failings. And don't give up on capitalism just because some, and he might insert here some SOBs, take advantage of the system. And don't give up on making this a more perfect union, even when the divisions of today tear at the fabric of who we are as Americans. If there's anything to be learned from the election of 1948, it's that we must confront obstacles and press on with hope and fortitude. Well, let me close with one final personal remembrance. After Truman retired, my father-in-law, who was still in Congress, wrote him a letter back in 1956, and he enclosed some clippings from the Congressional Record that he thought he might enjoy. Well, the secretary working for my father-in-law asked by what title she should address the former president. So he asked this question in the letter. Well, some years ago, the Truman Library provided me with a photocopy of the letter that he got back in return. And I think it tells us one final thing about Truman that's worth remembering. He starts with, "Dear Congressman Carnahan," and he thanks him for the article, and then he writes this: "Tell your secretary not to worry. She addressed me in exactly the right manner. Of course, you know I was presiding judge, and a lot of people here in Jackson County still call me judge. I was the U.S. Senator for 10 years, President of the Senate for 2 months, and President of the United States for almost 8 years. So any title that anybody chooses to use is satisfactory." And then he writes in longhand, "or no title at all." Well, truly, he was the man from Independence who was one of us. He always was, and with the help of the Truman Foundation and your many good works, he always will be. Thank you, and God bless.